You think you own something, but try stopping someone with money and power, and you'll find out how little you really control. That's exactly how Jake Carter felt when he woke up one morning to find his entire ranch blocked off by a massive, unauthorized fence. The smell of freshly cut wood and the sounds of hammers and nails being driven into posts filled the air. It wasn't just any fence, it was the boundary of his land, now surrounded by walls built by the Homeowners Association, or HOA, without any notice or permission. His ranch was his life, his heritage, and now it was under siege. Jake stepped outside, squinting in the morning sun, only to be met by the sight of a closed gate he couldn't open. The HOA had gone too far this time. They'd crossed a line. And Jake Carter wasn't the kind of man to just sit back and take it. He had inherited this land from his grandfather, who had worked it with his own hands. For decades, the Carter family had been a part of this land, a part of the community. But when the HOA decided to take control, to build a barrier around his livelihood, they didn't realize who they were dealing with. Jake wasn't just any ranch owner. He wasn't some helpless farmer without a voice. He was a man who understood the power of the law, and he wasn't afraid to use it. His grandfather had always told him, a man's land is his pride. Never let anyone take it, and always stand up for what's yours. Those words echoed in Jake's mind as he stared at the newly erected fence, his blood boiling with anger. Jake had fought for his land once before, when he was a young man, and he knew he would have to fight again, but this time, he had something that would turn the tide. He wasn't just a rancher anymore. He had learned the intricacies of property law, the rules and regulations that governed land ownership. The HOA didn't know it, but Jake controlled the gate. Jake knew the law better than anyone. He had a plan, one that would send a message to the HOA and make them think twice before ever crossing him again. The HOA, led by Margaret Harris, had thought they were untouchable. They believed their control over the neighborhood was absolute, that they could dictate every aspect of life, from the color of mailboxes to the style of fences. But they had made a mistake. Margaret Harris had no idea that Jake held the key to undoing everything they had built. He was ready. The first thing Jake did was gather evidence. He knew that in order to fight back, he would need documentation, proof that the HOA had no legal right to block his land. He walked the perimeter of the fence, taking photos, making notes. He contacted a local lawyer who specialized in property disputes, and after a few tense days of waiting, he had all the information he needed. He was ready to act. It wasn't just about the fence. It was about the principle, about standing up to a corrupt system that thought it could control his life. Jake had had enough. Armed with legal documents in hand, he approached the HOA office. Margaret Harris greeted him with a condescending smile, the same smile she always wore when she thought she had the upper hand. "What can I do for you, Mr. Carter?" she asked, her tone dripping with faux politeness. "I'd like to talk about the fence you've built on my property," Jake said calmly, pulling out the stack of papers. Margaret's smile faltered as she took the documents from him, her eyes scanning the pages quickly. "You can't do this," she said, trying to maintain her composure. "We have a community to protect. You don't understand the bigger picture." Jake's voice remained steady, but his words were sharp. "The only picture I understand is the one that shows me as the rightful owner of this land. You built that fence on my property without permission. And now, I'm going to make sure it comes down." The twist of fate wasn't in Jake's anger. It was in the calm confidence he exuded, the knowledge that he had the law on his side. Margaret Harris, the powerful HOA president, had no idea that Jake Carter, the quiet ranch owner, controlled the gate. And when you control the gate, you control everything. Jake sat at his kitchen table, a cup of cold coffee in front of him, his mind racing with the details of the next step. He had already gathered all the necessary evidence, but there was more to this fight than just paperwork. It wasn't enough to simply demand the removal of the fence. Jake had to send a message, one that would make the HOA think twice before ever crossing him again. Margaret Harris had underestimated him, thinking that her position as the HOA president would give her the power to do whatever she wanted. But Jake wasn't some easy target. He had learned the ins and outs of property law over the years. He knew the system, and he knew exactly how to use it to his advantage. As the days passed, Jake began to prepare. He made sure every document was in order, every piece of evidence carefully organized. His lawyer had already reviewed everything, and they were ready to file the necessary claims. But Jake wasn't going to rely solely on the legal process. No, he had a different plan. He knew the HOA had a reputation for bullying, for using their power to intimidate people into submission. But Jake wasn't afraid. His family had fought for this land for generations, and he would be damned if he let some bureaucrats take it away from him. The day of the meeting arrived, and Jake walked into the HOA office with a calm but determined demeanor. Margaret Harris was sitting behind her desk, looking every bit the part of the self-important suburban queen she believed herself to be. As Jake approached, she smiled her usual fake smile, one that never reached her eyes. "Mr. Carter, to what do I owe the pleasure?" she asked, her voice dripping with condescension. Jake didn't waste time with pleasantries. "I'm here to talk about the fence you built on my property," he said, his voice steady. Margaret's smile faltered for just a moment, but she quickly regained her composure. "The fence was necessary for the safety and well-being of the community," she said, as if her words held any real weight. Jake reached into his bag and pulled out the legal documents, the ones that proved the fence was built illegally. He slid them across the desk to her. "This fence is not only an eyesore but a violation of property law," he said. "I'm requesting its immediate removal. And if you don't comply, I'll be taking this matter to court." Margaret's eye scanned the documents quickly, her face slowly turning pale as she realized the magnitude of what Jake was saying. She had no idea that Jake had done his homework, that he knew exactly how to fight back. "You can't just walk in here and make demands like this," she stammered, her voice losing its usual confidence. "I don't take orders from anyone, least of all you," Jake replied calmly. "But I do take action. And the action I'm about to take is going to make sure this fence comes down." Margaret opened her mouth to protest, but Jake wasn't done. He leaned in, his voice low but filled with undeniable authority. "You thought you could push me around, Margaret. But I'm not the kind of man who sits back and lets someone take what's mine. You've made a mistake, and I'm going to make sure you regret it." Margaret stared at him, speechless, as the full weight of Jake's words hit her. This wasn't a man who could be intimidated. And now, he had the law on his side. Jake sat in the quiet of his truck, parked just outside the HOA office, taking a deep breath as he prepared for the next phase. He had made his intentions clear in the meeting, now it was time to let the legal system do its work. But something about the look on Margaret Harris's face, the way she had tried to dismiss him so easily, stayed with him. He wasn't just fighting for his land anymore, he was fighting to protect his family's legacy. Jake knew the stakes were high. He had seen this kind of power struggle before, but this time, it was personal. It wasn't just about a fence, it was about respect. For years, the HOA had bullied the residents of Willowbrook Estates into submission, and Jake wasn't about to let them add him to their list of victims. He had spent too many years working the land his grandfather had left him, learning every inch of it, making it thrive. No one, especially someone like Margaret Harris, was going to take it away from him. The next morning, Jake woke up early, well before the sun had even started to rise. The soft glow of the first light was just beginning to creep over the horizon, and the land was still and quiet, as it always was at that time. He drove down the familiar dirt road to the entrance of his property, his mind focused on the task at hand. He had made sure to document everything in the past few days, the fence, the land, the legal papers, and he was ready. This wasn't just about fighting for what was his, this was about making sure the community understood that no one was above the law, not even the HOA. As he parked his truck near the gate, Jake took another deep breath. The familiar smell of earth and grass filled his lungs, and for a brief moment, he let himself enjoy the peace and calm that came with owning land. It was his sanctuary. But that tranquility was about to be interrupted. Jake walked up to the fence, the large wooden structure that now blocked the path. He ran his fingers along the rough wood, feeling the weight of the situation. It wasn't just a fence, it was a statement from the HOA, an attempt to exert control over his property, over his life. He didn't have time to waste with back-and-forth arguments. His lawyer was already on the case, and he had filed all the necessary paperwork. Now, Jake was going to make sure the HOA understood that their move had consequences. His first step was to contact the local news. He knew that getting the story out there, getting the community involved, would put pressure on the HOA to back down. They couldn't just steamroll him without repercussions. If Margaret Harris thought she could intimidate him into submission, she was sorely mistaken. Jake knew the power of public opinion. By the time he had set up the meeting with the news station, the fence had become the talk of the town. Residents were calling him, asking if he needed help, offering their support. Jake was a quiet man by nature, but he knew when it was time to speak up. The community was behind him, and that was something the HOA couldn't ignore. As the reporters arrived, Jake gave them a tour of the fence, pointing out where the HOA had illegally blocked his land. The cameras rolled, capturing every moment, every detail. Jake spoke calmly, but there was a fire in his voice that couldn't be ignored. He made it clear that this wasn't just about a fence or a petty dispute, it was about the right to own and control his property. The news crew left after filming, promising to run the story that evening. Jake knew it wouldn't be the end, but it was a step in the right direction. That afternoon, Margaret Harris called him, her voice dripping with anger. "You think you've won," she spat. "You've just made things worse for yourself, Mr. Carter. You can't keep going down this road." Jake smiled to himself. "I'm not the one who started this fight, Margaret. But I'm going to finish it. I'm not backing down. And neither should the people of Willowbrook." He hung up the phone, feeling a sense of satisfaction. He had made his stand, and now it was time to wait. The ball was in the HOA's court. Jake knew they would try to retaliate. They always did. But this time, he wasn't going to let them push him around. Not anymore. He would take every legal measure at his disposal, and when the dust settled, he would reclaim what was rightfully his. The fence would come down, and Margaret Harris would learn that there were consequences for crossing the wrong person. Jake sat on the porch of his ranch, staring out at the sprawling land that had been his family's for generations. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the fields, and the quiet hum of the evening made him feel at peace, despite the chaos that had been unfolding. The fence was still there, standing tall and defiant. But Jake knew it wouldn't be for long. The phone call from the local news station had set things in motion, and now, the pressure was building on the HOA. Margaret Harris had underestimated him, thinking she could simply dismiss him as another landowner to push around. What she didn't know was that Jake had the community on his side, and that made all the difference. The next few days felt like a blur. News stories ran on local channels, talking about the illegal fence that had been erected on Jake's property without his consent. The town rallied behind him, and Jake's phone buzzed non-stop with messages of support from his neighbors, people he'd known for years. They were all tired of the HOA's overreach, tired of being controlled by someone who didn't care about the community. One evening, as Jake was preparing to head out to meet with his lawyer, the doorbell rang. He opened it to find a delivery man with a large envelope. The sender's name was familiar, it was from the HOA. Jake's stomach tightened. He had been waiting for this. The HOA had finally decided to respond. He opened the envelope and found a letter from Margaret Harris herself, filled with legal jargon and threats. It was a demand for Jake to remove the video footage of the fence and to stop spreading misinformation about the HOA's actions. They claimed that the fence was a necessary measure to improve security in the neighborhood. Jake smirked as he read through the letter. This was exactly what he had been expecting. Margaret wasn't going to back down without a fight. She thought she could scare him with her legal threats. But Jake had already made his decision. He wasn't going to remove the video. In fact, he was going to double down. He contacted the local news again, telling them about the letter and how the HOA was trying to intimidate him into silence. The story was picked up immediately. Within hours, the pressure on the HOA was immense. People were starting to ask questions, and Margaret Harris found herself in the hot seat. The following week, Jake received a phone call from his lawyer. The HOA had requested a meeting. Jake knew it wasn't going to be a friendly chat, but he was ready. He had already prepared himself for the legal battle. Margaret Harris was going to try everything in her power to force him into submission, but Jake wasn't going to let her win. The meeting took place in a small conference room at the local courthouse. Jake walked in with his lawyer, confident and calm. Margaret was already seated at the table, her arms crossed, looking as smug as ever. The tension in the room was palpable. Jake could feel the weight of the moment. This was where everything would either fall into place or fall apart. Margaret wasted no time. "Jake," she began, her voice laced with frustration, "you're making a huge mistake. This land, this fence, it's for the community's safety. You're making it personal." Jake leaned forward slightly, his voice steady. "No. Margaret," he said, "you're the one making it personal. You've overstepped. This is my land. You can't just take it without my permission." Margaret scoffed, but Jake wasn't finished. "I've got the law on my side, Margaret. And you might be the president of the HOA, but that doesn't mean you can ignore the rights of the people who actually own the land." The silence in the room was deafening. Margaret looked around, trying to regain control of the situation, but Jake could see the cracks in her facade. She was losing ground. The meeting dragged on, with more back-and-forth legal arguments and threats from the HOA. But every time Margaret made a move, Jake countered it with a calm, well-reasoned response. By the end of the meeting, Jake could tell that Margaret realized she wasn't going to win this one. She tried to hide her frustration behind a forced smile, but it was clear she had underestimated Jake from the very beginning. As Jake left the courthouse, he felt a wave of relief wash over him. This fight wasn't over, but he had made his point. The HOA couldn't just bully him anymore. They had crossed a line, and now they were going to have to deal with the consequences. Jake sat at his desk, the weight of the past few weeks pressing down on him. The meeting at the courthouse had been a pivotal moment, but the battle was far from over. Margaret Harris and the HOA were still not backing down. He knew they wouldn't let it go easily, they never did. The tension in the community had been palpable ever since the fence had gone up, and Jake had seen firsthand how far Margaret was willing to go to assert her control. But Jake wasn't just fighting for his land anymore, he was fighting for the future of Willowbrook Estates. Over the next few days, he kept his head down and focused on the next steps. His lawyer had advised him to stay patient, to continue gathering evidence, and to prepare for the long haul. He couldn't afford to rush into anything. The HOA would try every trick in the book to discredit him, to make him look like the villain in this situation. But Jake knew better. He'd been in enough tough spots to recognize when it was time to fight back, and now was one of those times. The news reports had started to die down, but the pressure on the HOA was building. Jake had seen neighbors he barely knew stop by to offer their support. People were talking, asking questions about the HOA's overreach. They were starting to realize they didn't have to sit back and let someone like Margaret Harris dictate their lives. One evening, as Jake was walking the perimeter of his land, checking the fence and making sure everything was in order, he spotted a familiar face. It was Tom, one of the neighbors who lived a few houses down. Tom had always been friendly but hadn't been one to get involved in the HOA drama. Jake waved him over. "Hey, Tom. What's going on?" Tom shook his head, his expression serious. "I've been talking to a few of the other neighbors," he said. "We're all fed up with Margaret and the HOA. We've had enough. We want to help." Jake smiled, a sense of relief washing over him. "I appreciate it, Tom. It's good to know I'm not alone in this." Tom looked around, making sure no one else was listening before he spoke again. "We're organizing a meeting," he said quietly. "A community meeting. We want to show the HOA that we're not backing down. We want to take action, together. Jake felt a surge of hope. This was the break he had been waiting for. The community was ready to stand with him, to take a stand against the bullying tactics of the HOA. Let's do it, Jake said, his voice steady. I'll be there. Let's make sure Margaret and the HOA know that they can't control us. The days leading up to the meeting were a blur of preparation. Jake worked with Tom and a few other neighbors to get the word out. Flyers were posted around the neighborhood, and word of mouth spread quickly. The meeting would take place at the local community center, and Jake knew it was going to be packed. He didn't know how much of an impact it would have, but it was a start. The night of the meeting, Jake arrived early. As he walked into the community center, he was greeted by a sea of familiar faces, neighbors, friends, people who had all had enough of Margaret Harris and the HOA's overreach. There was a palpable sense of unity in the room. Jake took a seat at the front, his heart pounding with anticipation. Tom stood at the podium, addressing the crowd. We've all seen what's been happening around here, he said, his voice strong. We've had enough of the HOA pushing us around. It's time for us to stand together and take back control of our community. The crowd erupted in applause, and Jake felt a rush of pride. This was it, the moment they'd all been waiting for. The HOA couldn't just control the neighborhood with fear and intimidation anymore. The residents of Willowbrook were ready to fight back. As the meeting continued, Jake listened intently as his neighbors spoke about their own frustrations with the HOA, stories of fines, unreasonable demands, and intimidation tactics. Jake's heart swelled with gratitude. He wasn't alone in this fight. And with the support of the community, they were stronger than ever. Jake stood at the back of the room, listening as his neighbors spoke passionately about the issues they'd been facing with the HOA. For the first time in what felt like years, he wasn't alone. The meeting had grown even more intense than he had imagined. People were fired up, ready to make their voices heard. As the crowd grew more energized, Jake felt a renewed sense of hope. This wasn't just about him anymore. This was about every resident of Willowbrook who had been silenced or intimidated by the HOA's power. Tom, who had organized the meeting, stepped back up to the podium, his face flushed with determination. We've all been fighting the same fight, he said, but it's time for us to take action together. We need to show Margaret Harris and the HOA that we're not backing down. It's time to fight for what's ours. The room erupted in applause, and Jake could feel the momentum building. He knew this was only the beginning. But now, the HOA had a real challenge on its hands. As the meeting came to a close, Jake stepped outside into the cool evening air. The weight of what was happening still hadn't fully sunk in. He had the support of the community, but now he had to figure out how to turn that energy into tangible action. He knew the HOA wasn't going to back down easily, but Jake was more determined than ever. That night, he went home and reviewed the legal documents once more. He'd spent weeks going through the details, ensuring every I was dotted, every T was crossed. It was time to prepare for the next phase of the fight. Jake wasn't just going to file a complaint. He was going to take legal action that would force the HOA to answer for their illegal actions. The next day, Jake met with his lawyer again. This time, the tone was different. There was no more talk of Niforth maybe. It was all about what they were going to do. They had a case, and it was time to use it. They would file a formal lawsuit against the HOA, demanding that the fence be taken down and that the HOA be held accountable for their illegal actions. Jake knew the road ahead wasn't going to be easy. It wasn't just about fighting Margaret Harris, it was about fighting the system, about taking on the power that had been used to bully and control the community for years. But Jake wasn't afraid. As he walked out of the lawyer's office, he felt a sense of clarity. He wasn't just protecting his land anymore. He was standing up for the rights of every single person who had been affected by the HOA's overreach. And that, he knew, was a fight worth winning. Jake sat at his kitchen table, the weight of the decision settling in as he stared at the documents in front of him. The lawsuit had been filed, the wheels were in motion, and there was no turning back now. He had always known that this fight would be a long one, but now that it was official, the reality of what lay ahead hit him harder than he had expected. He glanced out the window, where the fence still loomed in the distance, a physical reminder of everything he was fighting for. But Jake wasn't afraid. He wasn't the same man he had been years ago, unsure of himself and hesitant to take on the world. He had changed. The community had rallied behind him, and now, with the full weight of the law on his side, he felt more confident than ever. Margaret Harris and the HOA had underestimated him, thinking they could intimidate him into submission. But Jake wasn't backing down. It had been weeks since the lawsuit was filed, and the tension around Willowbrook Estates continued to build. The HOA was silent, at least on the surface. Jake knew they were working behind the scenes, trying to find ways to wiggle out of the situation, but every step they took only seemed to make things worse. The community, which had once been quiet and compliant, was now buzzing with anticipation. People were talking more than ever before, discussing the lawsuit, talking about the possibility of real change. Jake's phone rang one afternoon, and he didn't recognize the number. He picked it up anyway, his curiosity piqued. "Hello," he said, his voice calm but alert. The voice on the other end was smooth and calculated. "Mr. Carter, this is Margaret Harris," she said, her tone dripping with false politeness. "I think we both know why I'm calling." Jake's grip on the phone tightened, but he kept his voice steady. "What do you want, Margaret?" There was a brief pause on the other end, followed by a sigh. "I think we can avoid this whole mess if you agree to drop the lawsuit. I'll have the fence taken down, and we can go back to business as usual. No more drama, no more headlines. What do you say?" Jake could practically hear the smirk on Margaret's face, but he wasn't going to fall for it. "I don't think you understand, Margaret," he said, his voice unwavering. "This isn't about a fence. This is about standing up to the way you've been running this neighborhood. You've bullied people for too long. And it's not going to stop with me." Margaret's voice grew colder. "You're making a mistake. You don't want to go down this road." Jake leaned back in his chair, the words of his grandfather echoing in his mind. "I've been down tougher roads, Margaret. I'm not afraid of you or your HOA." With that, he hung up, his resolve stronger than ever. The battle was far from over, but Jake knew that now, more than ever, he had the upper hand. In the days that followed, Jake's lawyer kept him updated on the progress of the lawsuit. The HOA's defense was flimsy at best. They had no real legal ground to stand on. They had no right to block his land, and Jake had the law on his side. But Margaret wasn't giving up. She was already trying to find ways to discredit Jake, to twist the narrative. She was trying to paint him as a troublemaker, a man who had no respect for the community. But Jake wasn't buying it. As the case continued to unfold, Jake's neighbors began to speak out even more. They had seen the changes happening around them, the fear and intimidation tactics that the HOA had used. They didn't want to live in a community where their every move was controlled by a small group of people who didn't care about the well-being of the residents. They wanted their freedom back. And now, with Jake leading the charge, they felt like they finally had a voice. One evening, Jake found himself sitting on the porch of his ranch, watching the sun dip below the horizon. The land stretched out before him, peaceful and quiet. It had been a long time since he had felt truly at peace. But the fight was far from over, and Jake knew there was still a lot of work ahead. As he sat there, he heard the sound of footsteps approaching. He looked up to see Tom, the neighbor who had been so instrumental in organizing the community meeting weeks before. Tom smiled as he sat down beside Jake. "We're with you, Jake," Tom said. "We're not backing down. You've got this." Jake nodded, grateful for the support. For the first time in a long while, he felt like he wasn't fighting alone. With the community behind him, the law on his side, and a determination that wouldn't be shaken, Jake knew that the HOA's days of controlling Willowbrook were numbered. Jake sat in the lawyer's office, the tension in the air thick as his lawyer reviewed the latest motions filed by the HOA's legal team. The fight was intensifying, but Jake wasn't backing down. He had prepared for this moment, and he knew the next steps would determine how far the HOA was willing to go. Margaret Harris had proven to be a formidable opponent, but Jake had the law and the support of the community on his side. His lawyer pushed the paperwork aside and looked Jake squarely in the eye. "The HOA's defense is weak, Jake. They're grasping at straws. But we can expect them to escalate things, try to make you out as the bad guy, and drag this out in court for as long as they can. They won't go down without a fight." Jake nodded, a sense of determination building in his chest. He had seen the kind of tactics the HOA used to control Willowbrook, but it wasn't just about the fence anymore. It was about taking a stand for what was right. "I've come this far, and I'm not stopping now," Jake said, his voice firm. "Let them escalate. I'll be ready." The lawyer smiled, admiring Jake's resolve. "That's the spirit. We're filing a motion for summary judgment next. If the judge agrees with us, the case could be over quickly." Jake's heart raced with anticipation. The thought of seeing the fence come down, of reclaiming what was his, was within reach. But he also knew that the HOA would try everything in their power to delay and prevent the inevitable. He needed to stay focused and keep pushing forward. The next few weeks passed in a blur of legal documents, meetings, and community support. Jake's neighbors continued to rally behind him, attending every meeting, signing petitions, and even organizing protests outside the HOA office. The community had never been so united. It felt like a true turning point. One evening, as Jake walked down the dirt road leading to his ranch, he could see the flickering lights of a small crowd gathered near the entrance. His neighbors had organized another rally, this time in support of the lawsuit and the continued fight for justice. Jake approached, a sense of pride swelling in his chest as he saw the faces of so many people who had once been afraid to speak up, now standing together in defiance. Tom was there, waving Jake over. "We've got your back, Jake," Tom said, clapping him on the shoulder. "We've all signed on to help however we can." Jake smiled, his heart full of gratitude. "I couldn't do this without all of you. This is our fight now, not just mine." The energy in the air was palpable, the community coming together with a shared sense of purpose. Jake knew they had already won something far more important than the lawsuit itself. They had taken control of their own lives again. The following morning, Jake's lawyer called him with news. "The judge has ruled in your favor," the lawyer said, his voice filled with relief. "The HOA's motion to dismiss has been denied. We're moving forward with the lawsuit." Jake's heart skipped a beat. It was finally happening. The tide was turning in his favor. The fence, which had once felt like an insurmountable obstacle, was now the symbol of the HOA's impending defeat. Jake spent the next few days making preparations. He knew that the HOA would do everything they could to delay the inevitable, but now that the legal system was on his side, they didn't stand a chance. The support of the community, the legal victory, and his own unwavering determination were all the tools he needed to win this battle. It wasn't just about the fence anymore. It was about standing up for what was right. As Jake stood outside, looking out at the land that had been in his family for generations, he felt a sense of peace he hadn't felt in a long time. The battle wasn't over, but with every passing day, he could feel the walls that the HOA had built around his life starting to crumble. The real fight had just begun, and Jake knew that, with the support of his neighbors and the law on his side, they would prevail. Jake stood at the edge of his land, watching as the sun dipped below the horizon. The golden light cast long shadows over the ranch, and for the first time in a long while, Jake allowed himself to relax. He had fought hard for this moment, but it wasn't just about the land anymore. It was about the sense of justice that had been growing inside him, a fire that wouldn't be extinguished no matter how hard the HOA tried to snuff it out. The lawsuit had taken its toll on him, long hours, sleepless nights, constant pressure, but it was finally paying off. The HOA had made mistake after mistake, and now the end was in sight. He had become a symbol for the community, a figurehead for all the people who had been silenced for too long. Jake knew that the fight wasn't over yet, but he could feel victory on the horizon. As he stood there, lost in thought, his phone rang. He glanced at the screen, recognizing the number. It was his lawyer. "Jake, I've got good news," his lawyer said when Jake answered. "The court has ruled in your favor. The HOA is officially required to remove the fence, and they've been ordered to pay for the damages." Jake felt a surge of relief. It was finally over. The fence, the symbol of the HOA's control over his property, was going to come down. He had won. "Thank you," Jake said, his voice thick with emotion. "Thank you for everything." "You did the hard part," the lawyer replied. "You stood your ground, and that's what made all the difference. But now we just need to make sure the HOA follows through on the court's order. It's not over until that fence is gone for good." Jake nodded, but in his heart, he knew the worst was behind him. The HOA had been forced to comply with the law, and that was a victory in itself. In the days that followed, Jake's neighbors gathered to celebrate the victory. It wasn't just about the fence coming down, it was about what it represented. They had fought back against an institution that had tried to control them, and they had won. Jake stood among them, humbled by their support, but also proud of what they had achieved together. The HOA may have had power, but the community had something stronger: unity. The next morning, Jake drove to the entrance of his land, watching as the construction crew arrived to take down the fence. As the first section came down, Jake felt a sense of closure. The land that had been blocked off for so long was finally his again. He could see the open road, the familiar sights that he had missed. It wasn't just about the physical space, it was about the sense of freedom, of reclaiming his right to live on his land without interference. The removal of the fence was just the beginning. Jake knew that there was still work to be done to ensure that the HOA couldn't overstep again. He was already planning with his neighbors, talking about ways to keep the HOA in check and prevent them from abusing their power in the future. But for now, he allowed himself a moment of peace. The land was his once more. As he stood at the edge of the ranch, watching the last section of the fence come down, Jake realized that this victory wasn't just about him. It was about every person in Willowbrook who had stood up against the HOA, every person who had been silenced and intimidated. Together, they had shown that they could make a difference. And for the first time in years, Jake felt that the future of Willowbrook was in their hands, not the HOA's.